Chapter 3. The early period of recording the third series of Red Dwarf was a difficult time for me because I was already committed to performing in a new play I had co-written. Again, this play was to be premiered at the Edinburgh Festival 1989. The play was called Onan. It was an idea which had been knocking around in my head for a long time, and it finally came to fruition when I co-wrote it with actor and writer John Mackay. Onan was the story of two men who set up the first non-sexist, non-racist, right-on pornographic magazine. Yeah. The magazine was called Onan, named after the biblical figure who spilled his seed on the ground. I discovered that you can say spilled his seed on radio and television in interviews. However, if you say wanker, people seem to get upset. Funny old world, isn't it? Anyway, the play dealt with all the thorny issues surrounding the production and consumption of pornography, but it dealt with them in a humorous and witty way. We hoped. When I wasn't doing read-throughs and costume fittings for Red Dwarf, I was busy rehearsing Onan in an old school building in Hackney. John and I both appeared in the play, and our first night tryout took place in the Soho Poly Theatre in London. Considering it was a comedy, the laughs were few and far between. It felt very leaden and worthy. The big audience was crammed into their seats in this tiny basement theatre. Afterwards, John and I were both fairly depressed. We had both had successful shows the previous year in Edinburgh. Now we were going up with what felt like a bit of a dog. Everyone who saw the show in London was very nice about it. It's fantastic, guys. It really says a lot, says someone who looked faintly bored. I really laughed, said someone without cracking a smile. We were also in a bit of trouble because in the normal course of events we'd have had time to jiggle the play around a bit between the first performance and our arrival in Edinburgh. Now, due to my filming schedule, this wasn't possible. The day after this glamour-free premiere, I drove to Liverpool and checked in at the hotel. I was greeted in the bar by the full complement of Red Dwarf. The sound men, the cameramen, the vision mixers, the lighting technicians, boom operators, Rob and Doug. The whole lot of us took over the bar of the hotel. Craig walked in and was greeted at every table as he passed. Everyone in Liverpool knew Craig. He implied to me that half the people who knew him also wanted to kill him, so I moved myself slightly further away. We all went out for a meal, which, considering there was about 80 people in all, took hours of careful organisation. Craig and Danny went off clubbing. I had to go to bed. This is the story of my life. Everyone else goes off clubbing, I go to bed. The reason I went to bed was made apparent in the dark hours of early morning. My bedside phone went. I answered it. A Liverpudlian woman's voice said, "This is your early morning call, Mr. Llewellyn." It had started. This was my first day proper on Red Dwarf. Half an hour later, I was sitting in a make-up chair in the temporary BBC Liverpool studios, which were on the site of the Liverpool Garden Festival, which was on the site of the old docks, which was on the site of the older docks, which was on the site of, probably, a forest. Nothing is permanent on Earth. Nothing can be conserved. Change is the only constant. There we go. That's the sort of paper-thin philosophy I filled my head with as I sat watching Bethan Jones and Jill put my makeup on. This first day, I was sitting in the makeup chair for something like 6 hours. They were trying it out, testing different colours and powders, painting the mask once it was stuck on me. I'll say it just once because it's boring. But the masks are extremely uncomfortable to wear. It's hard to describe, and I've tried to do it many times. I've said things like, it's like wearing someone else's old socks over your face all day with a local anaesthetic, like the dentist gives you, and then sitting in a sauna. It's also like having mud slapped on your face and then dried so it goes all tight. What it's really like is having your whole head covered with prosthetic foam rubber. There is no way of knowing without doing it. It is hot, it is uncomfortable, it does make me a bit irritable. In fact, I'm a bit irritable now, just writing about it. Just leave me alone, will you? Just don't stand so close. Get off my case. Jesus! Okay, there, that's it. I'll really try not to go on about the mask. It may pop up occasionally, but I'll try and keep it to a minimum. It's that first day. I'll never forget it as long as I live. The irony warning light was on red alert. 6 hours in makeup. I finally stood up and stretched the stretch of the undead. I had a hyper stretch. My buttocks were as numb as a monk's trouser snake, as they say in Australia. I went into the costume department and was met by the lanky form of Howard Burden, the genius behind all the Red Dwarf costumes. I have to admit there have been times, maybe as a shard of fiberglass has wormed its way into my anatomy, or my shoulders have ached because of the armour I'm wearing, or when my core body temperature has gone so high I've seen Russian helicopters hovering over me ready to pour sand on my head. I have been known to call Howard things other than a genius. But it's all done with great love and understanding, because what you see works very well. And as we troopers in showbiz always say, that's what's important. Actually, that's bull. What we really say is, I really can't work in this cosy, love. It is sheer agony. On the first day, I got zipped, buckled, popped, riveted and velcroed and strapped into my costume. For 3 or 4 minutes, it's very comfortable. Then I try and sit down and my plastizote buttocks come flying off. I walked around in it for a while, visited the set where Craig was filming. It was incredible. The remains of a crashed spaceship could be seen stranded on top of an iceberg. It was all made of polystyrene and bits of old cardboard, but it looked great. They were filming the inserts for the episode titled Marooned. Craig was stumbling about in the snow being buffeted by a howling blizzard. This was created by an old Volkswagen car engine on a stand, attached to a giant propeller. It can create enough wind to literally blow you off your feet. It worked. Craig went flying very effectively. He was only too willing to do his own stunts. "Hey Ed, how about I come out the door and dive out?" said Craig, wiping the snowflakes from his hair. And land on me head. That'd look good." "Yes," said Ed brightly, "and you'd also be dead, which would leave me looking like a right wally." "Hey Eddie man," said Craig, "I can land on me head and no harm done. I'm a Scouser man, you know what I'm saying there?" "Yes, I know exactly what you're saying, and you are completely mad." Just as the wind machine was getting ready to blow Craig through the supporting wall of the studio, lunch was called. Another bit of standard Red Dwarf irony. I had spent 6.5 hours getting ready, and then I had to sit still for an hour and do nothing while everyone had lunch. I don't blame people for having lunch. I think it is their most fundamental human right to have lunch. It's just ironic, or sod's law, that it always seems to happen that I am just ready to work just before lunch. I went into the porter cabin that was my dressing room and sat down and looked in the mirror. The mask was extraordinary. It was impossible to see where the mask stopped and my face began. I looked at myself for a long time. That moment was the one and only time I was terrified of Crichton. It was the shock of being alone, looking in a mirror and not seeing yourself looking back. Someone else, some square-headed dork with chiselled features, was looking back at me. I looked closer. It was someone else. It wasn't me there. My heart rate went off the scale. I felt dizzy and nauseous. I felt as if someone had spiked my tea with a harsh, hallucinogenic drug. I was, as they say in Australia, off my face. I looked away from the mirror and tried to compose my thoughts. I really felt like I was going mad. I was really very scared. I had to get away from the mirror, but the movement of my standing caught my eye in the mirror again, and I looked back. There he was, that bloke with no hair and a cuboid head. It was horrible. I walked out of the porter cabin, through the makeshift dining area, and into the parking lot outside. I walked past people who were working on the show, technicians and office staff, and they all ignored me. They had no idea I just had the fright of my life. They couldn't tell if I was happy or sad, or angry or upset, or scared even. To them, I was the poor sod in the rubber mask. It made me super aware of how much we can give away with our faces when we think people won't notice. We are all, unconsciously most of the time, very good at reading people's faces. We can usually tell at a glance what sort of mood someone we know is in. If you remove that element, people start to cut you off, start to remove you from their mind's eye, take less notice of you. Is this what it's like being disabled or having a terrible facial disfigurement? You wander through a world where you are very aware that you're being cut out of the picture. When I was about 15, I visited the Museum of Mankind in London with my mum, and I saw a man who was also looking at the exhibition who had a hole in the side of his face the size of an orange. You could see the side of his jaw, his teeth, his tongue. The poor man must have suffered some terrible accident or had commando surgery for cancer. Whatever it was, the result was very shocking. I was torn, as I'm sure most people would be, and I tried not to look at him. I wanted to stare, but I'd been taught that staring was rude, so I looked away. I don't know what to do in a situation like that. Whatever your reaction is, it's wrong. "Cretin," said a voice with a French accent. "Do you want a cup of tea, Cretin?" It was Sylvie, the production runner. She was a very small French woman who could not pronounce the name Crichton and settled on Cretin, which means the same in French as it does in English. She looked me in the eye when she asked me if I wanted tea, then she gently reached up and touched my rubber face. "It must be very hot," she said. I nodded. It was very hot. I'd only been in it 7 hours and I was parched. It was interesting, however, that some people were not at all intimidated by the mask, and some were so horrified that they looked away. Sylvie's radio crackled into life, asking her to go into the studio. She replied, "I am making tea for Cretin," which meant the whole crew heard her call me Cretin. It was naturally only a matter of time before the rest of the cast were also calling me Cretin, especially Danny, who found it peculiarly amusing. Danny's laugh could easily win the International Full-Bodied Laugh Grand Prix. I got a cup of tea from Sylvie, and then I found I couldn't drink it. It was like trying to drink after you've been to the dentist and your lips are completely numb. I couldn't feel my own lips, but immediately the tea touched my prosthetic lips, they absorbed the fluid, and it tasted like I was sucking someone else's flannel in the bath. Did you ever do that as a kid? Suck your flannel? I did. My mum was always telling me not to suck my flannel, but at least it was my own flannel. I've got no idea why I did it. But imagine doing that, thinking it was your flannel and feeling quite happy about it, and then realizing it was someone else's flannel and you knew they had just washed their bottom department with it. Lunch was supplied by location caterers, my favourite form of eating ever. I will often agree to do a job if I hear the production is being made on location. It means one of those big trucks will be there with the 2 men inside who serve amazing food in the middle of nowhere. Here's a tip. If you see a film crew near your street, try and beg, borrow or steal a windproof jacket, a peaked cap with the name of a TV show or film on the front, and join the queue. The food is free and very nice. If anyone asks who you are, which is very doubtful, tell them you're from a company with a TV-type name. Teletechno, Telegraphic, TV Mazing, something like that. And you're on set to talk to Nick. There's always a technician called Nick on every crew. I've done this many times around North London. Of course, it does help if you know one of the lighting or sound people, but I've managed to get a free lunch from location productions where I didn't know a soul. There was a long queue leading up to the step of the location catering truck. I was salivating. I'd missed breakfast. I'd been sitting still for hours. My body was pleading with me for some form of low-level pleasure. Food, anything, an old carrot, just something different to the stifling tightness. I chose the roast beef with the cauliflower, peas and roast potatoes. I made my way from the truck to the double-decker bus, which serves as a dining room. I sat down and looked at this plate of food. How on earth was I going to get it in my mouth? I chopped everything up small and tried to get it past my lips without touching them. My prosthetic lips tasted so horrible by now, I didn't want them to spoil my lunch. I soon found that by tipping my head backwards, I could more or less drop food into my open mouth from above. After I'd done this a few times, I looked up and saw Craig looking at me sympathetically. "Oh, you poor sod," he said. I did feel pretty miserable. I stopped eating before I finished my plate and stared at what remained sadly. "Cretin, they want you in wardrobe," said Sylvie. So that was it. I couldn't really eat. After slipping into my costume, I use the term slipping in a comedy way, I had to go to makeup again to be touched up before going on the set. "You've ruined your lips," said Bethanne Jones, viewing the damage all that tea and roast beef had done. I was there another 30 minutes being re-glued, repaired and powdered, then finally I entered the studio to do my first shot for Red Dwarf. In the story, the cat was out searching for Lister and Rimmer on Starbug, which had crash-landed and was marooned on an ice planet. The cat had harnessed Crichton to a sledge, and the scene demanded that I pull this sledge, with Danny and a load of provisions, across a snowy landscape in a blizzard. He had to shout, "Mush! Mush!" as if I were a pack of dogs, and lash me with a bullwhip. He was so excited about it and kept walking around in circles, cracking the whip very expertly and saying, "Mush! Mush, critter! Mush!" I was not so keen. For a start, when I was tied up to the sledge, I couldn't get a grip in all the fake snow. So Peter Ragg tied another rope to the sledge and somehow managed to lie down on the floor and pull the sledge for me. That would have been cool, but then they brought around the wind machine, the one they'd been blowing Craig around with in the morning. To get a good blizzard effect, they would start up the wind machine and then pour washing soap flakes into the wind. Not a gentle handful. We are talking buckets of the stuff, literally buckets. Ed arranged the camera and they started the wind machine. As soon as it was up to full blast, which was deafening, they started the blizzard effect. Within seconds, due to intense eye pain, I realized my eye blink ability was severely restricted. The makeup was so heavy around my eyes that I couldn't really close them. Super painful shards of mild and gentle soap powder stung my forced open eyeballs. I grimaced and tried to cover my face. I couldn't see or hear anything. I finally turned away from the shot and someone killed the wind machine. I looked at Danny through soap vision. He was sitting on the sledge in a big fur coat. He was smiling from cheek to cheek. He was wearing cool tinted goggles and seemed completely unaware that the wind machine had stopped and everyone was walking around ignoring him. He was still saying, "Mush! Mush, critter! Mush!" "No, the shot doesn't work, chaps," said Ed By. Now there's irony for you. For the next hour or so we tried various different combinations of me pulling the sledge through various mixtures of fake snow. All of these combinations involved Danny sitting on the sledge going, "Mush! Mush!" In the final broadcast version of Marooned, none, I repeat, none of these shots were used. I thought that warranted a special irony warning light on the giant heavenly dashboard. What I didn't see was the upcoming irony klaxon horn, which was warning about the following day. Now, I have promised not to go on about the mask and the heat and the discomfort, and I won't, but this day continues to hold the record for being the most ironic of all. We moved to another hotel in Manchester, a very splendid place called the Midland. Not that I noticed its splendour when I woke up. 5:30 in the morning in Manchester is not a glamorous time. But what is glamour anyway? A fleeting feeling which leaves no trace. No, this had no glamour, sitting in the back of a taxi which smelt strongly of that special taxi air freshener, the sort that's in the little cardboard holder that hangs from the rear-view mirror and feels as if it's peeling a layer of skin off your nostrils. "Telly, is it?" said the driver. "Yeah, actually, it's a series called Red Dwarf. I play a robot," I said, trying to sound like an actor. "Never heard of it," said the driver. He wiggled his way through the back streets of Manchester and dropped me by the side of the BBC studios on Oxford Road. I stumbled into the BBC building and headed for the canteen. I knew how hungry I was going to get, so I thought I'd better stoke up. The canteen was shut. Irony warning light on orange. I went up to the makeup room and sat down. The process which took place I don't want to describe for two very good reasons. One, it's very boring, and two, it brings it all back as I write it, and I don't have my prosthetic counsellors here to help me. Suffice it to say, 6 hours later, I was laughing and joshing around in the costume department. I got changed into my costume and was then transported by cab to the Midland Hotel, where we were recording in a gym. Irony warning light to darker orange. In the episode called Body Swap, Lister and Rimmer have done a deal whereby Rimmer was allowed to have a go in Lister's body for a while. The scene we were recording was meant to show Rimmer exercising Lister's body by sitting in a jacuzzi, reading a women bodybuilder magazine and smoking a huge cigar. I entered with a huge selection of food for him to gorge himself on. I was then meant to light a candle with a flame coming from my finger and serve the food. Okay, by now the irony warning light was on red, but the klaxon hadn't quite gone off. Had this been a UN peacekeeping force, as opposed to my irony control, the F-111s and stealth bombers would have been in the air, missiles armed and ready. I noticed when I first arrived that the crew were all wearing shorts and t-shirts. Of course, this wasn't a gym. It might be called a gym, but really it was a sports and leisure centre. That meant it was a place where fat businessmen went to shower down and sit around sweating for a bit after a heavy night's drinking. "Morning, Robert." It was Peter Ragg standing next to me, holding a glove, a gas bottle and a lot of wires. He started to fit the glove on, run the wires and the gas tube up my sleeve and out behind my head. It's just an electric spark cigarette lighter, said Peter. Bog standard. We'll be back here, and on cue, we'll fire it up. A flame will come out of the end of your finger. You light the candle and blow the flame on your finger out. Then we turn the gas off. Great, that's fine, yeah, I said, which is Liberals speak for, oh my God, I'm going to die, but I don't want to be rude to this nice man. Ed Bye was chirpy and happy as usual. All right, chap, he said. Bit hot, I said, and then felt guilty for complaining. It's bloody boiling in here, said Ed. You must be roasting alive in there. This won't take long. Irony klaxon horns sounding for the first time. Just one blast, but I should have noticed. Craig came in, wearing a pair of swimmers and a dressing gown, looking truly like the Crown Prince of Packet. I suppose I should explain what that could possibly mean. The Crown Prince of Packet. It's an absurd collection of words that makes no sense. Well, the word packet, in this instance, is urban slang for the male genital protuberance. The entire package housed in clothing which is designed to enhance said offering rather than discreetly disguise it. Craig's wonderful Liverpudlian heritage is made up of 4 different races: African, Anglo-Saxon, Indian and Chinese. As Craig has said on many occasions in public and on stage, he's very grateful that he ended up with a Chinese body and an African cock, and not the other way round. He does indeed present a very eye-catching package. Hey, Crichty, you're looking good, man, he said as he shed his dressing gown and dropped into the pool. Craig was immediately in his element, looking at pictures of highly muscled, semi-naked women smoking a cigar and lounging in a warm pool. We went for a take. I had to push a trolley laden with food and not trip up over the wires and tubes strapped to my back. Craig was mouthing his lines. Chris would dub them on later. I had to guess when my cue was by watching his lips. Then I presented the food and went to light the candle. Peter saw his cue and hit the button. A sharp jolt of pain shot up my arm. I jerked. Then there was another. I'm being electrocuted, I said, not noticing there was a flame coming out of my finger. I waved this flaming digit around for a moment. It didn't seem to want to go out. I'm going to die, I thought. I'm going to burst into flames and die. Not while I'm trying to save a family in a burning building, not heroically, but while making a British comedy TV show. Peter Raggs saved my life by blowing the little flame out. The fact that he saved my life was a mixed blessing, I thought. It meant I was still covered from head to foot in rubber and plastic, standing in a sauna in a Manchester hotel, and we hadn't shot a thing. Don't worry, chaps, said Ed Bye, it's only a rehearsal. After they had stripped me down, we worked out that I was sweating so much under my costume that I had shorted out the wires leading to the gas nozzle. We tried the shot 6 or 7 times. Each time I got an electric shock, or the gas didn't light, or I blew my lines because I talked over Craig, or the sound of the jacuzzi was too much. I eventually went a bit dizzy and was taken to the exit, where it was much cooler. I can remember Paul Jackson being there, the man who'd got me this job. He'd come to see how things were going. How's it going, Robert? He said. It's fine, I lied. I'm just a bit hot. I think if people could have seen my actual face at the time, I would have been made to lie down. My face would have looked the colour of a baboon's arse. But it was Crichton's face, calm and smooth, kind and sympathetic, in a cuboid novelty condom sort of way. The rest of that day is a bit hazy. What we discovered afterwards was that if a human body sweats that much, you not only lose water, I was drinking 2 big bottles of mineral water a day and not urinating once, but you also start losing essential salts and minerally things. I don't know what happens, but what it means is you feel dizzy and tired and a bit sick. Of course, the final irony of ironies was that none of this footage was ever used. The scene was rewritten and done in a studio. This is the sort of irony where you need to learn breathing exercises and chant little Buddhist mantras to yourself, otherwise you go barking mad. Beth Ann turned up the next day with a box of diarrhea salts that you give little kids in Somalia when they've got the runs. It helps rehydrate them. I felt guilty because I thought I was depriving some poor kid in the desert, which is a classic self-centered middle-class guilt-ridden thing to do. The next 3 days were spent in various locations around Manchester, filming inserts for Backwards. This included Chris Barry and I walking backwards through the Piccadilly shopping arcade dressed as a mechanoid and a hologram. and an unimaginable amount of people utterly failed to notice us. You can see on the footage they used that most of the busy Tuesday morning shoppers were totally oblivious of the fact that they had just walked past two men, one who looked a bit like Captain Scarlet with an H stuck on his forehead, the other with a square rubber head and a shiny silver body, who was walking backwards. We had to walk backwards. I didn't understand this at the time, because when the film was run forwards, we would be walking forwards and all the shoppers would be walking backwards. After one of these long days, I went back to our hotel where we'd done the makeup, got cleaned off, had a shower, and drove to Edinburgh. That was a mistake, because I was utterly exhausted and I couldn't really see. But being a soft southern bastard, I thought, Manchester's in the north, so is Scotland, so Edinburgh can't be far. As I drove for hour after sleepy hour along near-deserted A-roads across the borders, often driving with my head out of the window to try and keep awake, I realised I was very wrong. I got to the little flat I'd rented in Edinburgh at about 2:30 in the morning to be greeted with tea and toast from John Mackay, my writing partner and co-actor in Onan. He filled me in on the gossip and told me what was happening with our show, which was due to open the following day. Chapter 4. The run of Onan went extremely well, after a difficult start when the audience clearly didn't know if we were doing a comedy or a tragedy. The show told the story of a magazine called Onan. For those of you who didn't have to attend Sunday school like I did, Onan was a bloke in the Bible who couldn't help playing with himself. He spilt his seed, and it was wasteful, saith the Lord, etc. Onanism was defined as a fairly major sin. If you ever played with your bits, you go blind. Let's make sure we only bring up children who are bent out of shape by the absurd guilt trips of their slightly pervy parents. So the idea behind the fictitious magazine was to be open and honest about this. Onan was a right-on, non-sexist pornographic magazine. It didn't hire models, it worked with independent women who just happened to be naked. I played the two-faced, pushy, ambitious founder, and John played the put-upon, ethically conflicted art director. Once we got into our stride, we flew through the season, got rave reviews, had lunch, stood in the bar, laughed like actors, which means throwing your head back and making a lot of noise. We didn't make any money, even though we were sold out from day one. We were packing them in. People were literally fighting for tickets. I used to go into the box office and hear, "Give me a ticket for Onan, you bastard!" Punch, thump, crash. "Get off, that's mine, you rotten pig," smash, tinkle. "Calm down, everyone. Why don't you go and see Paul Merton?" "'Cause we want to see Onan." Thump, crunch. Well, it wasn't quite like that, but it was fun. And I forgot all about rubber masks and time travel. I met Hattie every now and then. She was doing very late-night stand-up comedy in the same room I was working in, but that was the only contact I had with anything to do with Red Dwarf. Then I got a bit of glamour. I mean, it's sad, isn't it? But every now and then, a bit of glamour does wonders. After the final performance of Onan, the audience cheered and clapped. We bowed, ran off stage like actors do. I changed, washed my face, ran out of the front door of the assembly rooms, got in a taxi, got taken to the airport, and flew back to London. I wasn't driving in a knackered car with dodgy retread tyres. I wasn't in the back of a rattling transit van. I wasn't crushed on a bus for 9 hours. I was flying like a pop star. As the plane climbed and circled around Edinburgh, I could clearly make out the Scott Monument, Newtown, George Street and the assembly rooms. I could see the roof of the assembly rooms where I had climbed, illegally with a lot of drunk comics, to watch the fireworks display over Edinburgh Castle. Considering I've never lived in the city of Edinburgh, I've spent an enormous amount of time there over the years. I feel attached to the place. I can walk around the streets and look up at windows and remember, I had sex in that room once, or, that's where the party was where Jenny LaCote fell on my head, or that's the pub where I met Jasper Carrot. It's sad, really, isn't it, to admit that you have these sort of thoughts as you wander about. They're very personal thoughts, and I shouldn't have shared them with you. I sat back in my seat and felt a bit glamorous, and a bit sad. I think glamour and sadness go together very well as an emotional cocktail, like loneliness and self-pity, or love and happiness. I was sad because I was leaving my girlfriend Judy and a lot of my friends in Edinburgh, and now as I flew south, it felt like such a sudden parting. I'd barely had time to say goodbye to John Mackay, who I'd been working with so closely for the previous 3 months. I'd only seen Judy every now and then. She was performing her new one-woman show in another venue. Plus, I was missing the last day of the festival, where everyone walks around with a hangover and reminisces about what went on during the previous 3 weeks. I was also missing the big benefit gig on the last Sunday of the festival. I'd been involved in that for the previous 4 years or so. It was a great show, more like a party for the performers, with the added benefit of a huge audience. In earlier years, the benefits were for the Nicaragua Solidarity Campaign. But then there were democratic elections in Nicaragua, and the conservative opposition to the Sandinistas had a landslide victory, with the help of a few million US dollars, and the glamour went out of the Sandinista rebel cause. So the benefit became one for the Terence Higgins Trust. OK, now it's easy to be critical of benefits and what they do, reviving flagging rock stars' careers, etc. But for all the free publicity it gave to a lot of the performers, these events did raise a fair-sized dollop of cash. Anyway, I was missing all that as I sat 30,000 feet up and tucked into my British Midland chilled chicken roll. The man in the seat in front of me turned around and asked me, "Are you the bloke that was doing the play that said porn was good?" I'd had a lot of this during the run in Edinburgh. "Well, it wasn't really saying porn was good as such," I said defensively. "It was about a couple of left-wing, right-on, non-sexist men who set up a pornographic magazine." "Yeah, the play about porn being good, because it's already been done," he said. "Look at this." He handed me a copy of Forum magazine. "That's really what you were talking about, isn't it?" I argued with him. I said, what we were trying to say with the play was more about the state of politics in the country as a whole, rather than a direct commentary on the role pornography has to play in society as a whole, across the board, at this point in time, in any way, shape or form. I flicked through the magazine. I'd actually never looked through a Forum before, and don't get me wrong, I'm no porno virgin. I've seen it all. I had to do the research for the play. The trouble was, I started the research when I was about 13. But Forum had never interested me. There weren't enough pictures in it for a start. I handed the magazine back to the guy and tried to sleep. Of course, it was a bit futile, as the flight is only 40 minutes and we were coming into land. Red Dwarf rehearsals proper started the following day, in Acton. The first episode we recorded was Marooned, which meant Hattie, Danny and I had virtually nothing to do. It's one of my favourite episodes, not just because I'm not in it. I think it has some of the funniest lines from the series in it. Lister: "Are you saying I got a big bum?" Rimmer: "Big? It's like 2 badly parked Volkswagens." Danny, Hattie and I spent quite a lot of time in the BBC canteen as Chris and Craig learned reams of lines. The BBC canteen is on the top floor of the building, and on any given day there, you can see the stars. OK, you can see a few actors who are in a few BBC sitcoms. The actors from You Rang, My Lord are all dressed as if they're about to go and play golf, which is no doubt what they do. The people from Blackadder all look professionally depressed, which is probably how we all look too, that being a trendy look for our generation. During lunch break, Craig and Chris would join us, and we devised this thing called a loviometer, which would sound when we spotted a Major League love entering the room. Loveydom is a very specific complaint that is horrifyingly easy to catch, which is why the Blackadder and Red Dwarf actors appear so morose. A miserable countenance seems the best way to counteract loviness. A lovey is always pleased to see everybody, always up, always exhausted, i.e. working a lot, and always has a string of anecdotes a mile long, which have beautifully timed pauses and exquisitely timed delivery. They also never have a point or a punchline at the end of their stories, merely a raised eyebrow and a knowing expression. The end of a long and dull anecdote is when most actors realise they need writers. I know of very few performers who have never been struck down with loveydom at some time. I know I've had it, try as I might to avoid it. "Hello there, Robert, how are you?" says a very nice floor manager I worked with the year before. "Oh, God," I say, looking up to the heavens. "Utterly exhausted." Head shake. "Really exhausted. I just can't do it. You know why, darling? It's because I'm crap." Stare at person and nod vigorously. "I'm a crap actor. I shouldn't even be allowed in here." The nice floor manager knows the score and responds thusly. "You're a very funny actor. I saw your show in Edinburgh. It was excellent." "Oh, did you see it? Did you? What did you think? It was rubbish. I was rubbish. Utterly rubbish. No, I'm shagged, utterly drained. But it's really nice to see you. How are you? Oh, there's Ben." Elton: "I better go and say hi." Walk, walk, walk. "Hi, Ben." "Do I know you?" says Ben Elton. "Guards, take this man away." "Yes, indeed, ladies and gentlemen. A little bit political having guards, I understand that, but you've got to protect yourself these days." No, that's not true. I don't know many famous people, but I do know Ben Elton, sort of. Well, can I truly say I know anyone? Do we even know ourselves? Rarely. Anyway, Ben used to do his set before the Joeys in salubrious gigs like Chat's Palace in Hackney and the Covent Garden Community Centre. He's a very nice man, and there's an end to it. I'm not going to do some big lovey number about me and Ben going way back, because it's simply not true. During our time at the BBC rehearsal rooms in Acton, we would rehearse for 3 days, then have a technical run-through, which is where all the crew would watch. Then we'd climb aboard a coach which would drive us to Manchester. We'd check into the Midland Hotel, and I'd generally go to bed. Not so the rest of the cast. They would imbibe fermented vegetable products and discuss the issues of the day. On the rare occasions when I didn't have to get up the following morning at 5:30, I would sit with a long glass of mineral water and join the hectic banter.
"What's happening, Guy?"
says Danny. "Going clubbing, man," says Craig.
"Kicking,"
says Danny. "What are we drinking, chaps?" says Ed Bye. "Mine's a bud, thank you, Mr. Bye, sir." "Yes, indeedy," says Chris. "I'll just have a mineral water with lemon and ice," I say. "Wimp," says Craig, and jumps on me for no obvious reason. Suddenly, 3 very smartly dressed black men would enter the hotel bar, escorted by 4 or 5 drop-dead beautiful women, and Craig and Danny would go off clubbing, which I assumed had something to do with sex in interesting positions with people of a like mind, which is why they all joined the club, but that could be just me. There was one memorable occasion when I had already been woken by a rude alarm call, got semi-dressed, stumbled out of bed and got into the lift. Got out on the ground floor to be met by Craig and Danny, who had just come back from clubbing, and seemed to have enjoyed themselves greatly.
"Hey, Bobby man, come up to me room. We're going to sink a few before we hit the hay,"
said Craig as he gave me a hug. "Sorry, Craig, I've got to go to work," I said glumly, and wandered off towards my waiting minicab. Craig and Danny's energy never ceased to amaze me. If I'd stayed up all night drinking, dancing and doing other repetitive body movements in the close proximity of another person, I would need considerable medical attention for at least a week. This would have to be followed up by a prolonged period of counselling, therapy and the love and understanding of my friends and family. A few hours later, Craig would sit down on a make-up chair next to me. I'd ask him how he was. He'd take a puff on his cigarette and say, "A bit rough, man." A bit rough. If I'd done what he'd done, I'd be actually dead. Our 2 days in Manchester were pretty intense. The first day in the studio was where we pre-recorded all the complicated technical stuff. The second day was spent rehearsing with the camera and sound crew, and then recording the remainder of the show in front of a live audience. A live audience. It never occurred to me to be nervous about this. I had spent the previous 10 years in front of live audiences virtually every night of the week. But they weren't live Red Dwarf audiences. There is, in my now considerable experience, nothing like a Red Dwarf audience. As I entered the back of the studio in Manchester on my first live Red Dwarf recording, the buzz from the audience was extraordinary. Paul Jackson, the producer, went out to warm them up, which was a bit like warming up a car which has just driven 100 miles flat out. This audience was running hot. Paul was very good. He cracked a few rude jokes, and we were introduced one by one. "Ladies and gentlemen, playing Rimmer, Mr. Chris Barry." Huge, deafening applause, whistling and whooping. "Ladies and gentlemen, as Lister, Mr. Craig Charles." Stupendous, hysterical rapture. "Ladies and gentlemen, as the Cat." No more could be heard as Danny pirouetted into view, and the crowd went apeshit. "As Holly the Computer, please welcome Hattie Hayridge." Very interested, polite clapping, with the semi-audible audience thought of, "Ooh, so that's what the new Holly looks like." "As Crichton the Mechanoid, Mr. Robert Llewellyn." Polite smattering of semi-supportive clapping. The audience thinking, "Bloody hell, what does he look like?" The recording took place, and in the great tradition of BBC sitcoms, we had a warm-up man. He kept the audience entertained between the scenes when the cameras and lights were being moved. Every week, Craig would walk up to this man, take the microphone from him, and say to the audience, "You know who this guy is, don't you?" The man would buckle over in dramatic embarrassment. "You know who he is? I'll tell you. He's Ronald McDonald. He's the bloke in the adverts in that fucking clown outfit." Craig would then give the warm-up man the microphone, and we'd continue the show.
To give him his due, the man who had been Ronald McDonald in all those TV adverts of the era never took umbrage at the constant ribbing he received from the cast. It became part of the evening's entertainment. After the recording, I would head straight to makeup. Everyone else headed straight for the bar. By the time I was stripped, de-rubbered, oiled, pummeled, powdered and cleaned off, I would run to the bar just in time for a quick orange juice before getting into the bus and heading back to London. The journey back to London was often very rowdy. Everyone, except Mike Agnew, the floor manager, was high from doing the show. Mike would have worked so absurdly hard for the previous 2 days, he would flop down on the long back seat of the bus and be completely oblivious of the noise surrounding him. We would have videos of Star Trek playing on the lumpy TV monitors hanging from the ceiling. Craig would be roaming the coach looking for cigarettes, cans of beer or trouble. Danny would be holding court about how much Pavarotti earned.
"For just one night, Guy,"
he would say, dramatically holding your gaze, then suddenly,
"just one night, the geezer has to sing, and he doesn't get a fee, Guy. They don't give him no fee. They give the man a checkbook and say, 'Write out however much you want, Mr. Pavarotti, sir.' I tell you, that man makes serious money."
"What you on about, Dan?" says Craig, who appears from the seat behind. "Danny's just filling us in on the facts behind Pavarotti's bank balance," says Chris, "and very interesting it is too, sir." "You're not still on about Pavarotti, are you, Dan?"
"I tell you, Guy,"
says Dan, now seriously warming to his subject,
"he doesn't get paid in money, he gets paid in bullion."
"What planet do you live on, Dan?" asks Craig, reaching across to get a can of Wicked Strength lager.
"Bullion, man. He doesn't have a wallet. He gets followed around by a Securicore van full of his spending bullion."
"I don't expect all that money makes him happy, though, Dan," I say. "Bollocks, man," says Craig. "It will make me happy."
"He is a seriously rich guy, I'm telling you."
"I believe you, Dan," says Chris. "I'm perfectly prepared to believe the man earns some, as you so rightly suggest, serious spending bullion." "Not as much as you do, though, Chris," says Craig, laughing through his teeth. "Well, I'm not prepared to reveal the true scale of my earnings," says Chris. "No, but you do earn a lot of money, Chris," says Craig. No comment from Chris. "You bought that Bentley last year."
"A Bentley? Did you really buy a Bentley, Chris, man?"
asked Dan. "I'm afraid I did, sir," says Chris, who, because the subject has now turned to classic motor vehicles, is warming to the conversation.
"That is a serious pum-pum wagon,"
says Danny. I'm lost now. I have no idea what a pum-pum wagon is. Danny finds this very amusing.
"You don't know what a pum-pum wagon is, Guy?"
says Danny to Craig.
"Where have you been, Robert, man, with all your poxy Oxbridge mates? A pum-pum wagon is a car that you get a bit of pum-pum in,"
said Craig, making various gestures with his arms and central torso area which indicated sexual intercourse. "Oh, right, with you," I say, trying to be hip, failing miserably.
"A Bentley, man," says Danny. "That is serious executive pum-pum material."
"I must say, Dan," says Chris jocularly, "I've never seen the Bentley in terms of its pum-pumness, but now you mention it, you may well have a point."
"I'm telling you, Guy, you could get some serious pum-pum if you cruise around in that motor. You know what I'm saying? A Bentley."
Conversations not unlike these, in fact horrifyingly like these, would pass the miles between Manchester and London like syrup of figs helps you pass solids. Most of the time the talk would take place around Rob or Doug. And it's only now, looking back, that it becomes clear how one of the interesting developments in Red Dwarf has taken place in the 4 years I've been involved with it. Slowly but surely, we have each either grown like our characters, or our characters have grown something like us. This is not to say that Chris Barry is a git like Rimmer, far from it, but there are elements of Chris in the character. It's also, I hasten to add, not to say I am like a mechanoid, with nothing down there except plastic underpants and a trademark. But I do tend to do a lot of laundry and washing up at home. Craig and Danny also have many traits of their characters. And it is my humble opinion that as Rob and Doug got to know us better and listened to us talking on the coach, more and more of our own personalities, neurosis and character traits started to be incorporated into the scripts. At something like 3 a.m, the coach would pull up in the car park of the Acton rehearsal rooms. What a place to be at 3 a.m. Very low glamour rating. We would fall out of the bus and climb into a veritable fleet of waiting taxis lined up in the road. I would hit my pillow at about 4, still peeling bits of rubber from my chin and neck. But as I slipped into Slumber Town, I would glow with happiness. It was another 5 days without the mask, and 1 whole day off. Chapter 5. The following week, I arrived as usual at Acton. We read the script through, I was feeling more at home, I had more to do in this episode, and things were generally looking up. Irony warning signal on low. The episode we were recording was called Polymorph, a deadly creature which could turn into anything. It slowly became clear during the course of the day that at some time it was going to turn into a snake. Donna Di Stefano, our long-suffering assistant floor manager, asked me discreetly if I was scared of snakes. I told her I wasn't. I was a bit scared of really big spiders, but snakes were fine. She nodded and smiled. Why didn't I realize at the time? Why didn't I see that the reason Donna smiled that day was because she knew something I didn't? The rehearsals went well. Craig and I were enjoying the scene we did together when the polymorph turned into a pair of boxer shorts, which Craig put on, which then started to shrink, which meant I had to try and pull them off, while still having a vacuum cleaner hose attached to my groinal socket. At which point, Rimmer comes in and says, "You'll bonk anything, won't you, Lister?" It was a very funny moment, and it took my attention from the snake section, for which, in rehearsal, I used an old scarf. Off we go to Manchester, on the coach, tra-la. The next day is a long and grueling time in the studio, shooting all the polymorph changes. The rabbit which wouldn't hop, the ball which wouldn't roll, the shami kebab which wouldn't wriggle. In the end, they all did. The following day, we start camera rehearsals, and when we get to the snake part, Donna walks in with a long stuffed tube of cotton painted to look a bit like a snake. I say long. It was probably about 12 feet long, properly long. I laughed. I was getting used to these guys, always joshing about. We rehearsed with this great big long sausage until it was time for me to complete my makeup. On camera rehearsal days in Manchester, I used to have the unpainted mask stuck on during the day and have it finished off between the end of rehearsals and when the audience arrived. As soon as my makeup was finished, Donna Di Stefano took me along the corridor into a small room. I was only wearing a pair of underpants because I got so hot in the mask it's the only way to stay comfortably cool. In the room was a woman and a large picnic hamper. She opened the lid and I was introduced to Tina. Tina was a 16-foot-long, 7-stone python. Tina the python grinned at me as if to say, "You don't half look a prat with that mask on, and virtually nowt else." I'm assuming Tina was from Manchester, hence the badly rendered accent. The woman who owned Tina picked her out of the basket. Tina was a snake, i.e. she was supposed to be long and thin. She was long, but her middle section was thicker than my thigh, and she was heavy. They drooped her over my shoulder. It was like giving a shoulder ride to a 14-year-old kid. A big 14-year-old kid, with a taste for fast food. I have to say Tina was great to work with, very professional. I felt calm and relaxed. As I handed her back to the owner, I noticed double puncture marks along the woman's forearm. I asked about these strange-looking marks.
"Oh, she will bite, but it's not poisonous. It does hurt a bit, and you'll need a tetanus jab, but it's not dangerous."
There we go. The old irony warning light has been on all this time, and I didn't even notice. Once we were in the studio and it came to Tina's entrance, the show was kicking, as Danny would say. As the owner slowly pulled Tina out of the basket, the audience screamed. People squirmed in their seats as they watched this massive snake uncoil from her basket. She was hooked over my shoulders, and I had to hold her head up, look at her face, and say, "Snake!" That's all. It was a very brief shot. That's comedy. In the event, Tina didn't bite me, although she wouldn't do exactly as Ed wanted. When I wanted to lift her head up, I lifted her head, which was about the smallest part of her body. Suddenly, I felt this enormous strength as Tina suggested that she didn't want her head lifted up. She could easily have squeezed around my neck hard enough to literally pop my head off my shoulders. Here's the irony. If you watch the tape of this episode, you'll have to use freeze frame to even see a shot of me and Tina struggling to the death. However, the next moment has gone down in Red Dwarf history as one of the best moments. Craig and the shrinking boxer shorts. "Okay, so I've toured the world," he said grandly, "making people laugh. I have succeeded and failed. I've had them rolling in the aisles. I've had to delay my next line to accommodate the laugh. I've done shows where I know a laugh is coming and I've milked it. But I've never, in all those thousands of performances, had the experience of a moment like this. My ear was no more than a metre from Craig's mouth. He was screaming his lines out to me. I was screaming mine back at him. Neither of us could hear a thing. The audience made such a noise we couldn't hear ourselves think. Chris had to wait for ages to say his "You'll bog anything, won't you, Lister?" line. He just stood there looking at us with that face of his. That was enough for the live audience. They went bananas. The coach ride home that night was electric. Danny was reenacting the show, scene by scene for all of us, which was odd considering we'd all been there.
They were laughing so much, man, Bobby couldn't hear his cue line. We are talking major woof, man. I mean, that was a prime quality woof. You know what I'm saying?
Someone else would try and say something, but Danny was still in full flow.
Shrinking boxer shorts, man. A classic woof, I'm telling you. That'll go down in history, guy.
By the time of the third episode rehearsals, I had got into my stride. I'd started to remember everyone's name. John Pomfrey, the lighting man, Rocket, the head cameraman, Ron Tufnell, one of the cameramen who'd worked on the ill-fated Corner House series with me, Mel Bibby, the man who designed the sets and props, Keith Mays, the sound man, Howard Burden, the costume man. During the technical run-through, all these people and more would be standing around going through their scripts as we went through the episode. Ed Bye would stand where the camera was going to be and point at whoever was in the shot. This was a great help to us, as we would then know where the camera we were playing to was going to be. I was getting used to the lunches in the BBC canteen. I was less impressed when I saw a famous person. I was getting blasé. One day when Stephen Fry and Hugh Laurie and all the Blackadder people were involved in a big benefit concert called the Pretty Policeman's Ball, Ed Asner, the actor who played Lou Grant in the series of the same name, walked past me. I was impressed with him because he was old and American and a proper actor. Jerry Hall walked past me. I was impressed with her because she's famous and knows Mick Jagger, biblically. Someone else walked past me who I didn't know, and I was still impressed because I'm very bad at recognising famous people, so it could have been anyone. The one episode in Series 3 when I had a lot of mates in the cast was backwards. Tony Hawks and Arthur Smith were both old troopers from the comedy circuit. Well, not that old, about the same age as me. Arthur and I have done one of the most unpleasant gigs of our careers together, in a dungeon down a narrow alley in Edinburgh. It was during the festival, in 1987 I think, and we both had been talked into doing a spot at a local youth club to help them out. I was trying out new material for a stand-up set, and I'm a cheap show-off, so I was happy to do it. Arthur had a new suit and wanted to try that out. The youth club was very rough. Most of the youth were in their 20s, very drunk, and looked like the sort of people even a Brighton crusty with a dog on a string would avoid because they look a bit wild and unwashed. There was a stage, and on the stage were 4 students doing some sort of weird piece of theatre. They were being showered by beer mats and spit, but I thought, I'm a professional. I was wearing a suit and tie, and the piece involved me doing a striptease down to a super revealing lycra bodysuit, which, if I hit it right, could theoretically be very funny. I went up onto the stage and the booing and hissing was very loud. The beer mats started to fly, and then a beer glass. I took hold of the mic stand and shouted, "Thank you very much and good night." It was the shortest show I have ever done. I fled the place before Arthur even went on. About 2 hours later I turned up at the Assembly Room's bar and saw Arthur standing in another suit, holding a plastic carrier bag. I asked him what had happened. I was doing quite well, all things considered. They stopped throwing glasses and bottles and I was beginning to get a few laughs. And then a bloke walked up to me and poured a pint of piss on my head. It became a favourite anecdote of the festival. That's why I say old trooper, or maybe it should be nutter. How many of us would continue in a line of work after being abused like that by a customer? The Backwards episode, in which Arthur played the barman, became an immensely complicated thing to do. The script had worked out all the difficult areas of reverse logic. The only bit which confused us all was the fight sequence, where we had to work out when Craig's injuries disappeared, and how he would slowly feel worse until he reached the fight, when the pain would be unpunched out of him. This episode has gone down in Red Dwarf history as being one of the best, but when we were making it, it became harder and harder to understand what was going on. My biggest problem all the way through Series 3 was trying to learn my lines. At home, I'd started to wear a groove in the kitchen floor, pacing up and down for hours as I tried to get these complicated lines into my head. As I've mentioned earlier, learning lines has never come naturally to me, but I can do it. However, I felt inadequate when faced with a long Crichton speech. Rob and Doug's language is so unique. It's so free of cliché that it makes it very hard to learn. When I've learned other people's scripts, there is usually a turn of phrase or a sentence structure which you recognise and you already have at your disposal. It's therefore fairly easy to learn, as you almost know it already. You only have to memorise it in order. With Crichton Talk, this is never the case. Rob and Doug will never use a hackneyed turn of phrase. They'll always come up with a new way of saying something. This is one reason I love their scripts when I first read them, and hate their guts as I try and learn them. It is also the reason that the series is so popular and has lasted so well. The writing is quite simply brilliant. There were times as the third series wore on where a new and tortuous Crichton line would make us all laugh simply because it was so tortuous. The standing joke was that Rob and Doug would write me a 5-page long explanatory speech telling the rest of the crew how black holes work, or that time dilation would save us from the horrific fate overhanging us. This speech would be very long and very hard to learn, and it would start with the word listen. Most importantly of all, at the end, Danny would smile, show his teeth and say,
"I was with you until you said listen."
This, of course, would bring the house down. In the rehearsal room, there were 2 old bunk beds which stood in for the beds in the officers' quarters, where a lot of the action in Series 3 took place. On most mornings I would arrive, script in hand, still trying to do that killer speech on page 7 to 10. Donna Di Stefano would be going through her props. Ed Bye would be pacing around working out his camera script. Chris Barry would be on his mobile phone trying to fend off offers of work and see if he could fit in a 4 o'clock. It took me a while to find out what a 4 o'clock was. I know that during the Second World War, gunners in British and American bombers used to point out enemy fighters to each other using the clock as a common reference. Hence, "Look out, the Hun at 5 o'clock, high chaps, give 'em hell." However, Chris Barry's 4 o'clock is a voiceover recording at 4 o'clock in the afternoon, hopefully after rehearsals. Not quite so brave and dashing as the World War II gunners reference, but with a charm all of its own. On the top bunk there would be an inanimate lump, otherwise known as a sleeping Craig Charles. In the lower bunk would be a far more elegant body, stretched out, but likewise fast asleep. This would be the graceful frame of Danny John Jules. Everyone would work quietly so as not to wake them until rehearsals began at 10 o'clock. I have no idea what Danny and Craig did during the night in those days, but it clearly didn't involve sleep. They made me feel so old. They did in fact call me Grandad for a while when we each revealed our ages over lunch. Well, Hattie wouldn't reveal hers. I politely didn't ask, being a nice, middle-class, well-brought-up chap. However, such niceties didn't hold Craig back, who immediately said, "Come on, how old are you, man?" Hattie wasn't having it, and her age remains a mystery to all of us to this day. When they found out how old I was, they were amazed.
"I'll be dead before I'm that age, man," said Craig. "I've peaked already, man. I'm 24 and I'm burnt out."
When I gave him a lift home that night, he was quite animated. Normally, Craig fell asleep as soon as he closed the car door. But this time there was no stopping him.
"It's amazing how old you are and you're still going. I'm shagged, man," he said. "I started in this game when I was 16 doing poetry and that. I got married real young. I was on telly regularly by the time I was 18. I've got there too quick, man. Now I'm shagged out. I'm burnt out, man. There's nothing left. I'm a husk. It's all over for me, man. I'll never get to your age."
I was very worried for Craig. I have a weakness when I listen to other people. I always believe what I'm told. The next day, I had foolishly expected Craig to be likewise subdued, but he was bouncing around like a spring chicken. Looking back on his speech now, from 5 years later, it does seem rather amusing. Craig has immense energy and an annoyingly good memory. I say annoyingly for 2 reasons. One is that he can pick up a script, look at it a couple of times and then lose it, and he knows all his lines, he knows all Chris and Danny's lines, and most annoyingly knows mine better than I ever will. The other thing he has a good memory for is conversations and statements. I would say something one year and then completely contradict it the next, as I'm wont to do, and the only person who remembers what I said before is Craig. "That's not what you said last year, man," he'll say with a cheeky grin. "Isn't it?" I'll say, racking my brains trying to remember what I might have said.
"No, on January the 23rd last year, you said completely the opposite."
The annoying thing is, he'll be right. I have learned, though, that remembering lines is very much to do with trust. In the episode titled Time Slides, the one where Crichton got to do a bit of air guitar work in the darkroom, I had to do a difficult speech, apologising to Rimmer for referring to his mother as an old trout. "I compared your mother to an aged, blubbery fish," and on and on. Try as I might that week, this speech got the better of me. Hattie tried to help me remember it by breaking the speech into a list of first letters. That meant an aged blubbery fish, a simple-minded, scaly old piskeen, became ABFASMSOP. It was hopeless. I couldn't remember a word of it. Nothing seemed to help. I was very downhearted about it and constantly lost my temper when trying to memorize it. If I stumbled in rehearsals, I would bark out, "Don't tell me! I know it!" and then promptly prove that I didn't know anything. Come the night of the recording, Mike Agnew, the super hard-working production manager who fell asleep in the back of the bus, had provided an idiot board with the speech written on it in capital letters. He tucked it away behind part of the set so the audience wouldn't see it before the scene. The idea being that he would turn it around just before saying action. Under the pressure of the moment, no one remembered to turn the card around before we started recording the scene. There's always 900 things going on at once. It's hardly surprising. The first few exchanges between Crichton and Rimmer went very well. Chris had huge long speeches to do, twice, 3 times as much as me, and he sailed through them beautifully. As we approached my killer speech, I noticed out of the corner of my eye Mike Agnew crawling across the floor, desperately trying to reach my cue card. I realised what was going on, but somehow I didn't panic and started the speech with ease. I managed to get through it, not word perfect, but close enough for Rob and Doug. It was the first time I'd ever got past the first phrase. Meanwhile, Mike was in an agonising position by my feet. I had to step over him in order to do my exit. The thing is, it's amazing what an audience can do for a performer when the pressure is on. The more hours I spent trying to learn this speech, the less I could remember. The more angry I got with myself, and the more hopeless it became. As soon as I relaxed, it was fine. A salutary lesson, no doubt. I've often wondered if proper actors have been taught how to learn lines. By proper actors, I mean the ones who went to drama school. I didn't go to drama school. I barely went to school at all. I was forever running away and skiving off to smoke cigarettes and practice swearing. I did try to go to drama school once, after I'd been performing for a bit. I thought I'd give it a go. I knew I could get a grant back then because I'd never been to university. I think it's important to remind young people today that in the era when Tony Blair went to university, you actually got paid to go. You would get a grant that covered your fees and gave you enough money to live on. Sounds ridiculous now, but it really was like that. I applied to get into the Central School of Speech and Drama in St John's Wood, London. I got a form and an explanatory booklet. I had to learn 2 bits of Shakespeare and 1 of contemporary. I borrowed the complete works of Shakespeare from a friend and found the passages. Bit of Hamlet, bit of Two Gentlemen of Verona. Neither of them made any sense to me at all, although I'd seen both plays and enjoyed them. I asked another friend what contemporary bit of theatre I could do. I fancied doing something like a speech from the film Bullet, starring Steve McQueen. I was told this wasn't quite appropriate. In the end, we settled on a speech from the Threepenny Opera by Bertolt Brecht. I spent a couple of evenings trying to learn this stuff, then turned up at the school for my interview. I sat in a room full of young men who looked just like me. My height, my hair colour, my build. The only difference was they were all quite good at acting. I was eventually shown into a room where 3 people sat behind a table. They asked me to do my Shakespeare. I nodded calmly, stood up, shook my hands about in an actory sort of way. The 3 people looked expectant. I stood like a Shakespearean actor and said nothing. I couldn't remember a thing. "Would you like a prompt?" someone asked. I had no idea what a prompt was, but I nodded seriously. "And what kind of man is this?" said the man who was sitting behind me. "Oh, yeah, that's it," I said. "I remember now. What kind of a man is this? Don't tell me, I'll get it in a bit." Hopeless. They didn't ask to see my other Shakespeare, but asked for a bit of the contemporary piece. They asked what I was going to do. I couldn't remember what it was called. "Kurt Weill?" said one of the people behind the table helpfully. "Yeah, it could have been," I said, scratching my head. "Bertolt Brecht," said another. "That's the fellow," I said, pointing at them and clicking my fingers. "It's a piece by Bertolt Brecht called Jack something." "Jack the Knife?" "You know it, don't you?" I said, smiling. "Yes," said the man behind the table, "but I don't think you do." "Come and sit down and tell us a bit about yourself, Robert," said the woman who was sitting next to him. "Why do you want to become an actor?" "Oh, I don't really want to be an actor. I'm just a show-off, really, but I can get a grant for 3 years, you see, so I thought I wouldn't have to work." The 3 people behind the table nodded gravely, but they didn't give up. "Have you had any acting experience?" "Not really, no, not proper acting. I've done a lot of comedy and mime stuff, street entertaining and cabaret." "Can you ride a horse?" asked one of the men. Weird question, but I told them I could. I'd grown up in a village in Oxfordshire, and I'd ridden lots of horses. They seemed pleased at this positive bit of news. "Have you done any fencing?" I thought this was a bit of an odd question too. I thought they were talking about acting, and suddenly he asked about fencing. The thing was, I had done fencing. "Well, yes," I said. "I did quite a lot of fencing on a farm I used to work on, mostly wire mesh, but some post and rail stuff too." I was thanked for my time and told to ask the next young hopeful to come in as I left. I thought I'd done pretty well, all things considered. They didn't offer me a place, strangely enough. If they had, I would have gone to college with Gemma Redgrave, apparently. I have since discovered that proper actors don't get lessons in how to remember lines. They just get a lot of practice, and like most things, the more you do, the easier it becomes. The last episode of Series 3, The Last Day, was a favourite of mine, because for one fairly large section I wore an evening suit, which was far more comfortable than the normal Crichton uniform. Also, because it was the last episode of the series, there was a bit of a party atmosphere going round, and there was to be a party after the show. As the makeup came off for the last time, I breathed a huge sigh of relief. Never again would I have to sit still for 5 hours having someone dab my face with a sponge. Never again would my eyes be glued open and have bright lights shone in them. Never again would I sweat so much each day that I wouldn't need to take a pee. It was all over. Forever. As I walked from the BBC studios to the rooms we were having the last night party in, I was a deeply happy individual. I felt a great sense of achievement. I'd worn a full-face, full-head prosthetic mask for 18 days, and I hadn't killed myself or anyone else. The party was great fun. I'd made friends with a lot of new people, but I knew what would happen. As soon as we all went our separate ways, no matter what promises we'd make, we'd never see each other again. At one point, Chris Barry stood up in the corner of the room and did a short routine depicting a day on the Red Dwarf set, which had everyone on the floor laughing. His impression of Rob, Doug and Ed were amazing in their observation. His Craig Charles was breathtaking. "Hey man, I do all my own stunts. Just stuff a load of explosives down my jockstrap. No problem, man." He did a wonderfully funny impression of Peter Ragg, the special effects and model wizard. His Danny John Jules was magnificent. And watching the people's faces who are being impersonated is fascinating. They stare with slack jaw, trying to work out who he's doing. People very rarely recognise themselves, but everyone else does immediately. Chris only had to pull a face, and we all knew who he was being. He didn't do a Robert Llewellyn at this particular party. I would have to wait for that dubious privilege. The next morning it was the long, and even for me, slightly hungover coach ride back to Acton. Once in the car park, we bid our farewells, and that was the end to it. I had great fun doing Red Dwarf, but they had made 3 series. More or less every comedy series made by the BBC lasts for 3 series. Some, like Fawlty Towers, only do 2, so it had had a good run. The general feeling going round was that Red Dwarf Series 3 was the last one. I didn't mind. I had plenty going on.